Hey everyone, so some of you may already know, but those who don't, my name is Jordan Liddle and I work on Shopify's developer experience team. Now it's our team's goal to ensure that our partners have the tooling and resources available to build confidently and efficiently on our platform. So if you've ever sifted through our API documentation, tried one of our tutorials, participated in an early access, or even dropped a question in our API forums, well, you've experienced some of the efforts of my team. So my Twitter handle is there on the screen if you'd like to connect after the webinar. I'm always happy to chat, especially around developer experience. We can talk about GraphQL or anything in general. Just feel free to reach out. I'm super excited to be here. I'm really hoping you'll come out of this webinar stoked about GraphQL and thinking of cool new ways on how you can build on the Storefront API. So let's get started. So the big question, what is GraphQL? Well, GraphQL, it's a query language. It's a query language for APIs. It provides a more efficient, powerful, and flexible alternative to REST. So when most people get on the topic of GraphQL, they hear query language and think of something like SQL, but for graphs. And I don't blame them. Most applications today have the need to fetch data from a server where that data is stored in a database. Then it's the responsibility of the API to provide an interface to the stored data that fits an application's needs. But GraphQL, it's not a database technology. It's a query language for APIs, not databases. So that means you can build a GraphQL layer on top of your existing API. Now, at its core, GraphQL enables declarative data fetching, where a client can specify exactly what data it needs from an API. This is a new concept, and when I was initially wrapping my head around it, I used Legos as a way to help me understand. Now, I'm sure at some point in time in your childhood, you've toyed around with Legos, and maybe even some of you still are piecing together blocks in your spare time today. But the great thing about Legos is that it's not really prescriptive, is it? Like, you could follow the building instructions, but you can also just grab the pieces you want and build from there. We build our Lego creations in a way that works for us. So say you're building a Lego castle, but you'd prefer to start with building the Lego drawbridge. Now, in a RESTful world, you'd probably make an API call to get all the drawbridge pieces, but you don't really get to decide what pieces arrive in the response, do you? Maybe in addition to a big dump of Lego pieces, you get more than what you ask for. Say a few Lego guards, some castle flags, and well, how did Lego Batman get in there? In any case, it's leaving you to sort through what's actually important to you. But in a GraphQL world, you can ask for whatever you want, and exactly what you asked for will be returned to you. Instead of multiple endpoints that return fixed data structures like what many of you are used to today, GraphQL, it only exposes a single endpoint. And there on the screen, that's our GraphQL endpoint, just one single endpoint. And it responds with precisely the data you're asking for specified in a GraphQL query. Okay, so GraphQL versus REST. You're gonna hear this argument a lot. How does it really differ from REST? Well, I don't want to spend this entire conversation kicking around REST. Is it really inefficient? Well, that depends. But GraphQL does solve a lot of the frustrations associated to REST today. So take Shopify Mobile, for example, our mobile app. To demonstrate one important reason why Shopify decided to invest in GraphQL, let's look at the Shopify Mobile screenshot. You can see that on the right side of the slide here. Now, the screenshot, it does seem pretty trivial, right? It's got some customer info, a few unfulfilled line items, but in reality, it's actually the result of an elaborate operation involving some pretty heavy data crunching. It targets customer information, order status, risk levels, product variants, etc. So let's actually take a moment here to go over all the information Shopify needs to process to place this beautiful view in your mobile device. Now, for the customer section, the app needs to know how many orders a customer has placed, their shipping information for the specific order, and the shipping info from previous orders, In regards to the order itself, the app needs to look up the cart's line items and which items have been fulfilled or not. It then has to get all the risk information about that specific order, and then in addition, to try to render order events in the timeline section there in the bottom. Assembling all this data into one single place requires multiple round trips to the server, which risks making the mobile app slow and unresponsive, which is a pretty risky move, especially when mobile network conditions are variable. And multiple round trips not only slow down the app, but they also eat into a customer's data plans. So enter GraphQL to cope with the underlying need for more flexibility and efficiency. So now, today with the Shopify Admin API, what you are all used to today, we solve the above problem by breaking away from true REST APIs. We embed certain associations to certain resource endpoints when the need arises. For instance, if you get, say, products123.json, just a show product page, we return information about the product, but also its variants, images, and options. These are all different models. So ultimately, we end up with a one-size-fits-all responses where you cannot request less, no more than what we give you. Now, there's like lots of other differences between REST and GraphQL that stretch outside the scope of this webinar, but I definitely encourage you all to explore them whenever you get a chance. There's like numerous blog posts, articles, videos touching on this subject alone. Now, I'd be doing my team a great disservice if I didn't touch on the developer experience around GraphQL. Since GraphQL, it changes the developer experience as we know it. So before we jump into an exercise, let's take a moment to learn about that. So Shopify put several initiatives in place to make the transition to GraphQL as easy and enjoyable as possible. And we'll be working on lots more in the months to come. So let's take a sneak peek at a few of the neat perks of the developer experience when using GraphQL today. So if you're going to be using GraphQL, you need to try Graphical. Now, toying with REST APIs, you may find yourself making curl calls or using HTTP clients like Postman, and this is all okay, but there's a few nuances that, well, they're not immediately apparent. For example, if you send the wrong type of argument, or say you want to explore what options are available, you have to rely on the API to be descriptive and helpful with clear messaging, documentation. But if you send a certain parameter in a write request that isn't expected, well, Shopify will actually just ignore them altogether. It gives you no insight into the fate of that certain parameter. But if your server speaks GraphQL, and ours does now, you can just use Graphical, which is defined as a graphical, interactive, in-browser GraphQL IDE. That's a mouthful, I know, which has a ton of great features. Let's start with embedded documentation. So you can see there, documentation is a first-class citizen of GraphQL, and Graphical, it leverages it. The right-hand pane exists for you to explore the possible queries, mutations, which we'll get into later, fields, their types, if they're required, the works. It's like full maintained documentation right embedded into your sandbox. So, and just as GraphQL supports deprecation, so does Graphical. Graphical will automatically remove deprecated fields from the documentation. Shopify is able to track deprecated fields to know when they're executed and when it's safe to remove them. For debugging, speaking of round trips earlier, when you're testing an endpoint, you may find yourself running back to the documentation, back to the app, back to the docs, and so forth during your debugging process. But Graphical, it supports debugging as you type. See that? Giving you hints and pointing out errors. It also has a JSON viewer. You can see on the right-hand pane. GraphQL responses, well, they don't actually have to be JSON, but that's how we do it. And Graphical comes with this great JSON viewer with all the niceties you'd expect. Code folding, automatic indentation, copy support, and they even have like a read-only option. So you won't accidentally delete or edit. Now, Shopify has a growing collection of incredible developer tools to help expedite your workflow when using GraphQL API. So if you feel like learning by example, Well, we have a number of great example apps so you can see GraphQL in action in your favorite framework. Okay, so GraphQL developer experience is a game changer. Now, let's see GraphQL in action using Shopify's very own Storefront API. We'll take a moment just to kind of explore what the Storefront API is for those who might be unfamiliar. So the Storefront API, it gives you full creative control to build customized purchasing experiences for your customers. So unlike the admin API, which enables developers to build apps around merchant-facing actions, like such as order management, shipping, fulfillment, the Storefront API, it focuses on shopping experiences seen from the customer's perspective. So using the Storefront API, you can do things like fetch data about a single product or a collection of products to display on any website or device. It creates unique checkout experience with full control over the shopping cart. And you can also create new customers or modify existing ones. And it even allows you to allows customers to select unique product options. So today, we have a number of Storefront SDKs that all utilize the Storefront API. These custom Storefront SDKs is what we call them. They make it simple to develop new and unique shopping experiences on web with the JS BY SDK, on mobile with the iOS SDK and Java SDK, and in-game with the Unity BY SDK. Now, there's some really interesting examples today that leverage these SDKs. One of which is Alto's Adventure, where you can make in-app purchases. So for those of you unfamiliar with Alto's Adventure, it's like this 2D endless runner game where you play with Alto and his friends and you ride down this steep hill and there's like llamas and you get to jump. It's a really cool game. I definitely recommend it. But let's take a second to actually see how this in-app purchase works. And that's it. Okay, so let's get started with the Storefront API. Now, it's quite simple to get up and running with the Storefront API. One thing that's like pretty important to note is that the API requires a Storefront access token for making authenticated requests. The Storefront access token, it can be included as a request header. And since many applications, such as Shopify sales channels, they have a need for delegating anonymous access to the public resources of a shop, they have the ability to provision a Storefront access token and then provide this token to the consuming client, say a mobile app, for example. So today you can quickly get a Storefront access token just for the sake of getting up and running via the Shopify admin, like so. I'm going to demonstrate with my test shop here. Okay, so I have a test shop called a GraphQL-webinar, doesn't really matter. If we're in the shop, you can just simply go to apps, and you'll see an option to manage private apps, where you can create a new private application. And we can give it a name. Let's just say GraphQL testing. And if you scroll to the bottom, you'll see that there's an option to allow this app to access your Storefront data using the Storefront API. If you select this option and save, you'll see that it should issue a new Storefront API access token. And there it is. It's as simple as that. Now, there's also a REST API where you'll see in our admin API reference where you can actually create a Storefront access token via the REST API. You can delete an existing one. You can get access or get a list of all the existing. So there's different ways to get this access token, but just for the sake of getting up and running, the private application is probably one of the best ways to go. Okay. So there's obviously some really cool use cases for the Storefront API, but let's actually take a second to explore Shopify's own embedded graphical explorer. And let's make our first GraphQL query on Shopify. Now, for anybody that would like to follow along, feel free to visit help.shopify.com/API/storefront-API, and you'll see an option to load the GraphQL Explorer. And you could even launch it in its own window. And there it is. So this is graphical. Now, we're not actually going to go into like too much detail on how to structure a GraphQL query, syntax gotchas, best practices, relay, that sort of thing. We'll save it for another webinar. But I'll also provide some great resources at the end of this webinar that can really get you comfortable with the query syntax and relay and whatever else you might need. But today, let's pull some data using GraphQL to demonstrate the query language. So let's start with something simple, like grabbing a shop's info, including its name, description, and money format. Now, you can see that we actually have this query pre-populated. This is just a cool little thing to get up and running. But one thing you'll notice is that there's this shop field, and it's important to note that this is called the root field of the query. Now, everything that follows the root field, it's called the payload of the query. So in this root field shop, we want to get, what did we say? We want to get the shop name, description. There's that auto completion. That is so cool. And then we can even get, what do we say, money format? Okay, great. So let's run this query, see if it works. So there it is. You see this beautiful JSON syntax. It's exactly what we asked for. We want the shop, its name, description, money format. It's all responded to us in exactly a way that we described. Now, we can't really do too much with this query. So let's grab the shop's info, but it's also its first 3 products. Now, one huge advantage of GraphQL is that it allows for naturally querying nested information. So in this example, if you wanted to load all the products associated to a shop, you can add this in your query. And we'll try that here. Oop. Products. Okay, this is interesting because we're already getting an error here. And if we actually try to do this, okay, so we're actually getting an error saying you must provide one of first or last. You'll also notice that there's some weird stuff happening here. We'll get into that in a few. But basically what this is saying that, well, these things called products, for example, in this case, it needs an argument. And the product field can take a number of arguments, like first or last, to only return up to a specific number of products. So we actually need to throw an argument here saying, well, let's grab the first 3 products. Now, if we run that query, we get the first 3 products returned to us, and we're asking for the ID of those products. So you may have noticed, yes, those weird terms like edges and node. Now, this has to do with pagination and also something called GraphQL connections. So let's take a moment to chat about that. So we know that a shop can have thousands of products, sometimes hundreds of thousands of products. And if our API returned one continuous list of data, well, then things can get pretty messy. So that's why it's important to paginate our data and provide data in small, separate, digestible pages. So this is where GraphQL connections come in. Now, connections can be a bit hard to understand because they use some pretty nonsensical terms like node and edge. But to shed some light on the meaning of these, let's go through an example to describe GraphQL connections. So the data from a custom storefront, it can be represented as a graph. So to see the image on this slide for an example of that graph structure. The circles in the graph, well, they're called nodes, and the lines of the graph, well, they're called edges. And an edge is a line that connects 2 nodes together, representing some kind of relationship between the 2 nodes. So how would we represent the Storefront API using this data structure? Well, here's that graph again, but notice the different labels. So you notice how some of our nodes now have the label like product or image or shop. So nodes are the resources in this case. So back to the query. So we have a query root, a payload with the name, descriptions, and the products, which is the product connection. So we want to get, in this query, the first 3 products that are connected to the shop, which would be all the connected products in our graph. So now let's say we want to see the top 3 variants that are connected to each of the products. What would that query look like? Let's take a shot at it. So we're grabbing the first 3 products. We can actually grab the title of that. Now, if we were to say, give us the variants, well, if we run that, we'll see we have the same error that we need to actually pass an argument. We want the first 3. And you'll notice that this actually is called the product variant connection. And we can even load up the documentation in the side panel if we wanted to explore a little bit more about what fields are available. But we can also just ask. We can say, well, what about price? What else does a variant have? It also has a weight. Sure, weight unit. Why not? Now, what you'll see is when we run this query, we get everything we asked for. The first 3 products and their first 3 variants. Pretty cool, huh? So that's it. We're making some GraphQL queries. Now, if we wanted to demonstrate the power, the flexibility, and efficiency of GraphQL, let's see one of our example apps in action. And I mentioned earlier that we had a repo called Storefront API examples. Now let's maybe just grab one from the repo, which I already have listed and cloned. We'll check the node GraphQL client. So if we load up here, hopefully you guys can see this okay. Let's start up this app. Like I said, I've already cloned it, but you guys feel free. You can go there, clone the app, play with whatever example apps you want. And we can see that we got the app actually listening on port 4200. So if we go here, so there's the app. This is the front end. Everything's kind of being rendered here. We can see that we have a title, which is the shop name. We have a description there, which is just shop description. We got product variants. We got images, names, prices, product options. You can even have the ability to add to cart. So this is pretty neat. This is a lot of information rendered on a single view, right? And if we were to do this with REST, it would probably take us multiple round trips to the server. But if we actually peel back the layer here and see the back end, this is our app.js file, and we won't go into too much detail on how this app is structured, but we can actually see that GraphQL query. And this is one single query asking for all that information and being returned to us, which is then rendered in the view. So that's it. It's pretty cool. That's the power of GraphQL in action on a simple web view. Now, just you can imagine the opportunities that you can achieve with the Storefront API. And this is all cool. So I'm sure some of you might be wondering, well, what about modifying data? Since we've been doing a lot of reading data using GraphQL, but we haven't done any writing. So the good news is that it's all possible with something called GraphQL Mutations. So mutations, there generally are 3 kinds, and similar to CRUD with REST, create, update, read, and delete. With mutations, you can create new data, you can update existing data, and you can also delete existing data. Now, mutations also follow the same syntactical structure as queries, but they always need to start with the mutation keyword. This is important to know. Now, mutations can also take arguments as inputs, similar to the body of, say, a post request in REST. The Storefront API also comes packed with a lot of great mutations that you can find in our Storefront API reference. We might take a second to explore that afterwards. But let's try an example for how we might create a new checkout a new Shopify checkout through a GraphQL mutation. Now, unfortunately, the graphical editor that we have available in our documentation is read only. So you can't actually perform GraphQL mutations with this graphical interface, but there are some options available today, lots of options. In fact, you could download the graphical desktop app, which I actually have here. It's at github.com/GraphQL/graphical. It's really simple. You can just clone the repo and you can have a live demo on your desktop, and you can perform mutations, read only, whatever. You might have to configure it to include your storefront access token, but that's super easy. You can also do it through curl. You can also do it through your own favorite HTTP client. So let's try using Postman to see how a GraphQL mutation might look here. So if we look at the Storefront API documentation for a checkout create mutation, so let's actually go up into our documentation here. We see the Storefront API. There is the reference, which includes mutations. And there's our checkout create mutations. We could see that it gives us an interactive example, which is really cool. I definitely recommend trying this out. You can see that it takes some arguments, which is that input, which, like I said, is similar to the request body of, say, a RESTful post request. And there's also input fields. And you can see that we have the checkout line item input field, which has required fields, which are quantity and variant ID. Okay, so we know that we need the variant ID. All right, so we've done this before. We've wrote a basic GraphQL query to get some desired data from a shop. So let's use my test shop again to grab a product variant ID to then use in the checkout create mutation. So I actually have these requests pre-populated here for brevity. Let's just go to the variant query. So we'll go through this actual request, some of the details of this request here. We can see that first thing to note, it's a post. It's not a get request. It's not a put. It's a post request. And here's my shop, GraphQL-webinar.myshopify.com, and you can see that the endpoint is -API-GraphQL, the one single endpoint that we have. Now the headers. Notice that content type header is set to application./GraphQL, not JSON. And we also have the X Shopify Storefront Access Token, which I mentioned earlier is something we need. So actually, let's go back to my shop, grab that access token, and populate it in that query, or header, I should say. The query is here in the body of the request. You can see that has our shop, which is that root query, and we have the payload, which is asking for the first product and the first variant of that product, and please just give us the ID, because that's actually all we really need. So let's actually try to make a request, and hopefully this will work. Boom, very cool. So this is it. We have our variant ID to actually use in the checkout create mutation. So I'm going to copy that. And we'll go to checkout create. So same thing, post request, one single endpoint. We have our headers, and we got the body of the request where you can see there is the input object, which has the line items, the variant ID, and the quantity. And we're just gonna dump the variant ID in that field there. So notice this is pretty neat. So like with a query, we're also able to specify a payload for a mutation in which we can ask for different properties of the new checkout object. So that's really cool. So in this case, we're actually asking for the ID of the checkout. You can see here the ID, we're asking for the web URL, and also let's just get the title and quantity of that first line item. So if you probably noticed we also don't have a storefront access token here, so let's go back and grab that. Otherwise, the request will fail. So if we send this request using Postman, There it is. We just created a checkout on Shopify, and we even have the web URL in the response that we can simply copy and paste. And let's just see this, see if this worked. We'll just go into my browser, copy and paste that web URL. And there it is, a Shopify checkout with our single line item, a fluffy pony, a very expensive one, ready to go. So let's go back to the slides here. And talk about a peek ahead. Now, Shopify is obviously betting on GraphQL. We have a number of Shopify folks that are hugely active in the GraphQL community. The Shopify engineering blog, it contains many articles about our technical stack, including GraphQL. We're continuing to open source some of the tools and code that we've developed while working with GraphQL in the near future. And for example, actually, there's these client libraries that allow you to interact with the GraphQL Storefront API in your preferred language. We have a JavaScript implementation and a Ruby one on the way and more to come. So we know that there's tons of opportunities with the Storefront API and GraphQL. You can do so much with this API, and we're really, really excited to see all the creative ways that you can leverage it. And that's it. That about sums up our webinar for today. And it is a lot of information to take in less than an hour's time. So definitely don't feel like you're supposed to be some sort of GraphQL expert by the end of this webinar. It's just merely to inspire some creativity and kind of get you, familiar with the syntax, a little bit familiar with just like how everything's structured. And hopefully you can check out these learning resources and take your learning to the next level. There's everything's listed there. Feel free to take it down. We'll also, you can feel free to ping me on Twitter, and we can, I can offer a lot more resources from there. But for now, we have How to GraphQL, which is a great resource to really understand the GraphQL syntax and everything about it. Developers.shopify/custom storefront SDKs is definitely the center for leveraging the Storefront API. There's obviously the link for the Storefront API examples. We actually have the GraphQL JS, the JavaScript client I mentioned earlier there. And Learn Relay is another one that can kind of give you a little bit of an idea about how we use GraphQL connections and pagination. So like I said, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter if you do have anything specific you'd like to chat about. But for now, we'll jump into our Q&A. Okay, just loading this up here. So Ethan asks, is the access token safe to put into client-side JavaScript? It is. This is obviously going to be exposed, but with the GraphQL queries, these are basically the data. The data isn't, it's available to anyone. Yeah, so it's definitely safe to put it into the client-side JavaScript, but the data that we do expose isn't really considered something that's private. And the merchant will have to accept the permissions. Like if you were to issue a storefront access token via the REST API, it goes through the same process of the merchant is aware of the exposing of certain data. So Chris asks, can you use the GraphQL APIs to apply line item level discounts, or do you still need to use the line item scripts? This is actually a really good question. I believe you can, but Chris, if you can hit me up on Twitter, I'll get an answer for you after this webinar and just make sure that I'm giving you the right information there. David asks, what security concerns are there over the broad access permissions for the Storefront API token? I don't think I'll be able to go too much into this, but like I said, the merchant basically accepts the permissions to expose certain levels about products. And like, because you can't perform mutations on like admin resources, like you can't modify orders, or say you can't modify products in any way using mutations with that public storefront access token, The data that we do expose is basically what you would see from any customer perspective. You know, say if you're on Shopify storefront and you see products and their prices and everything else, all that stuff is public anyway. So we just allow it to get that data via a storefront access token in the GraphQL API. Have you seen, someone asked, have you seen any implementations using React Native? Are there any limitations? Yeah, you'll actually see in that Storefront API example, I believe there's a React example in there. It's not React Native, but I'm pretty sure that I've seen something around there before, that there is an implementation that maybe a third party's done already, but feel free to hit me up on Twitter and I'll do a little bit of research after this webinar just to confirm. I can't think of any particular limitations using React Native. Okay, somebody asks, why are the IDs different than the REST API? This is a good question. IDs in GraphQL are like base 64 encoded. So the IDs between, say, like the two APIs, they're not joined together. There's different ways to cross-reference, say, a resource that's been accessed via the REST API than one that's been accessed via the GraphQL API. I know that our engineering team is looking into exposing potentially the REST API IDs, but I'll know more in the coming weeks. Okay, Anders asks, I'm not a developer, so maybe a dumb question, never any dumb questions. Can GraphQL, not Storefront API, be used to manipulate product info? So create, update, delete, for example, data from a PIM to Shopify. So because we don't have a public admin API, you know, like the merchant API where you have product resources, images, whatnot. We don't have that publicly available, so you can't actually create or update product information. You wouldn't be able to say modify a product's pricing. You'd only be able to do what's available via the customer purchasing experience, essentially. Forgive me if I don't say your name right, but Isan asks, are there any rate limits on Graph API calls similar to the REST API? I believe that we do the rate limiting based on IP, and you can make 120 parallel requests per second. I know for sure that someone is currently working on some documentation around this and how to best handle that API call limit. The team has made a point to ensure that you actually don't hit that limit. So I would stay tuned on the Storefront API documentation. There will be some docs around that quite shortly, probably in the next couple weeks. Nathan asks, will the REST API continue to be supported? Totally. I mean, like, we have such a large ecosystem of RESTful developers, like we would never just not support it. Like, there's continued effort into our REST API. Just with GraphQL, we see that there's obviously some massive opportunities, and it does have, like we went over quickly with the GraphQL versus REST section, there's a lot of benefits to using GraphQL. So we'll see a lot of investment in GraphQL, but obviously continued maintenance in our REST API. Brian asks, is the whole point of using GraphQL to use Shopify as a platform to integrate into other applications? That is one use case, definitely. I think the point of, like, GraphQL is the technology that we leverage with the Storefront API. So you could integrate it with other applications. We see the Storefront API being actively used for marketplaces, sales channels. In reality, it's just like anything that you want to create a custom experience for purchasing products or what have you. You can do that with the Storefront API. I mean, if you want to order from your toaster oven, anything's possible with that. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, actually, I think that's all for the questions. Unless anybody has any last minute ones, feel free to dump in. And like I said, feel free, if you got a question afterwards, if you take a moment to actually explore the documentation, you have a creative idea, you want to just talk about GraphQL in general, just feel free to hit me up on Twitter and we can take it from there. Oh, someone is asking, are there any theme limitations on GraphQL APIs, or are they accessible by all themes? Not that I can think of. I mean, if you like Shopify themes, you wouldn't really need to use GraphQL there. I mean, you could, and there's not any limitations as far as I'm aware. But if you had, say, like a custom theme or what have you, like say if you went on to a theme designer website and downloaded the theme, and you can for sure use GraphQL with it. It'd be a perfect example of how to have a custom purchasing experience with your own theme hosted on your own server. Okay, cool. So I think that's all the questions for now. This has been like a really, really cool time hanging out with you all. I really hope to hear from you via Twitter, and definitely check out the documentation. Feel free to let me know if you have any specific questions, or what you liked, what you don't like. And thank you all so much for coming. This was a lot of fun.